The whole world is watching. The United States is playing its ultimate economic card in this game, which is we will cut you off of our market. We will cut you off of buying things you need here, and then you'll really have to bend. Now, for many years and for many countries, this worked. And now we have an example where it doesn't work, where the country in question is too big, too well developed, has got too many allies to whom it can turn, and so it doesn't have to knuckle under, and it's in anything standing up and saying, nope, I cannot exaggerate what this means to every country in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The United States had an empire. When the British Empire faded, the American Empire stepped up and took its place. It organized its empire differently. It didn't have colonies the way India was a colony of Britain, but it had economic subordination of everybody else in the world. And partly this was because coming out of World War II, we were such an important economic unit in a wrecked global economic system. Remember, the war destroyed Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan. I mean, we were the only ones left who came out of the war stronger economically than we had been in the Depression before the war. So the reality was we were crucial. Europe couldn't have rebuilt itself after the war without the Marshall Plan, which was money we lent to the Europeans, which they then used to buy the goods from the United States with which they rebuilt. All of that is now over. It took a long time, 70 years roughly, for all of that to fade away. And Americans lived high off the hog most of that time. The dollar became the global currency. Everybody had dollars in their central bank as the support alongside of gold for their own currencies. And what you're seeing now is the world having become more important relative to the United States, and no country demonstrates that more than China, which is the great success story of economic development of the last half of a century. And they are coming into their own. That's why it's China, as opposed to somebody else, taking this step. I know it's a different situation, but I would urge people. The United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, moved NATO over to the Russian border, from the Baltic states in the north through Poland all the way down to Bulgaria. The last step in that process was the NATOification of Ukraine. And the Russians, backed by the Chinese, said no. They would have liked to say no before, in Poland or in the Czech Republic or in Slovenia. It doesn't matter. They couldn't. Now they can. You have to ask yourself the question, what happened? The Russians are part of the BRICS. The Russians are now a close ally with China. Mr. Putin has said that they feel themselves to be a Eurasian country or an Asian pivot, whatever you want to call it, but they're standing up militarily, and the world is noticing they can. And now the Chinese are doing it economically, and the world is noticing they can. Look, China has spent a lot of money and a lot of time building the BRICS alliance. The United States has a worse relationship to its allies now than it's had in a century. There was just an election in Canada where a candidate came from behind because he was the big anti-Trump, and the other guy, not so much, okay? And you're going to be seeing that kind of thing all over the place. And that's how you have to understand what the Chinese are doing. They used to buy soybeans from the United States. They will now get their soybeans from Brazil. No problem. They used to get their energy, as you listed it, in small part, never a big part, from the United States. Well, guess what Canada is going to do? One of the major exports of Canada is energy. And where does it go? To the United States. And what is Mr. Trump threatening? A tariff. Okay, China will now go to the Canadians, and they will have a marriage of convenience between the two. Each of them will escape the problem of the United States by working together. And let me drive home a very, very important point. This is going to be very difficult to undo. These are relationships that are built up. These are understandings. These are schedules of what ship will be loaded up with what, going from where to where. You don't unravel that overnight. And these relationships, a good number of them will not come back to the United States, even if Mr. Trump were to cancel the trade war at some point in the near future. That's what's happening as we've talked about it. The United States, in the quest to control its empire, is becoming isolated. And for the United States, that is the opposite of running an empire. And Americans are going to feel that everywhere and starting right in their pocketbook. Part of Mr. Trump is unquestionably a nostalgic notion that there was a time when businesses could keep their profits because it's so bitter to have to part with the taxes you have to pay. And maybe even for the mass of people who can also fantasize how nice it would be if that tax was not withheld from my check every week when I come home from my job. Sure, everybody wants not to have to pay taxes, but everybody also wants the government to do all kinds of things for the society, which are necessary for a modern standard of living. Now, here comes the punchline. If you're willing to sacrifice the mass of your people to live below the modern standard of living, well, then you can indulge your nostalgia. You can actually do what you just outlined. Cut your income tax on corporations, the profits tax, cut your income tax on individuals, shift the burden of taxation onto trade. That's no different really from what a number of the most conservative states in the United States have done. They've eliminated their personal income tax. New Hampshire is famous for that. Texas, I believe, doesn't have one, and so on. What did they do? They put the burden of taxes not on tariffs, because they're not allowed to do that by our law, but they did it in sales taxes. Here, I live in New York City. I have to pay a sales tax to the state of New York, and on top of that, another sales tax to the city of New York. And I have that on top of income taxes to both of them. So we are taxed like crazy here. We don't want any more. You can get that from every one of my neighbors all day long, every day. And they are tempted to vote for politicians who say something, whether they do it or not. But let's be sure we understand what that meant. Sales taxes are regressive. You pay the same 10% on that bottle of bottled water, whether you're Mr. Rockefeller or you're you and me. The way income taxes usually are set up, they are progressive. So what you're really doing is shifting the burden of government onto the average people, everybody paying the same, which is an immense gift to the richest and to the corporations who are exempt from doing sales taxes. So putting it on tariffs, a tariff is a kind of sales tax on an imported object. When Mr. Trump talks, it's very carefully choreographed that he only talks about the income tax versus the tariff. And you know who'll be, ironically, the biggest victim? Medium and small businesses. They can't pass on the tax they will have to pay the way big corporations often can. You remind us correctly that at the very beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. Congress passed the laws that created the modern income tax. And if you go back and you look at it, the initial income tax only affected the richest 2% of the American people. It was a tax on the rich. No question about it. And the rich hated it and denounced it because of that. When they failed to prevent that, they changed their strategy. And what they did over the rest of the 20th century was change the rules on who was subject to the income tax. So it went from the super rich to everybody else, which is why we have now the reaction of the corporations. Well, now let's get rid of the whole income tax, a very clever tactic, because now that average people have to pay it, they too can be won over to vote for a politician who says, I'm going to get rid of the, as you put it, internal revenue source and do it on an external one. Not understanding that in the end, the tariffs will be moved by every business able to do it onto the mass of us as a sales tax. And once again, one class benefits and the other class pays the bill. Well, the basic answer that economic historians have given for quite a while now is that it was a disaster. It was a major contributor to the crash, not so much to the particular crash itself, but to the inability of the system to recover from the crash, to take the steps. And the reason they didn't was the lack of coordination. They had all become enemies of one another. It was called beggar my neighbor. You took the steps that protect yourself that hurt your neighbor. Your neighbor couldn't sell to you because you had made a tariff war. So they punched back and built a tariff war around their yard so you couldn't access them. Everybody was at everybody else's throats. Everybody had readjusted their supply chains and everything else to deal with a nationalist focus. So when the system as a whole hit a real speed bump, everybody was on their own. Everybody tried to get out of the depression at the expense of everybody else, because that's what they've been practicing for throughout the 20s, and that was a disaster. That lack of coordination meant that, every country was on their own. They couldn't handle it. By the way, that is a very dangerous foresight about today. If you have a world in which we are no longer cooperating, even the way we did under the aegis of a U.S. empire, when we're now having trade wars and hot wars and who knows what kind of tariff wars, you're recreating the nationalist focus, the lack of cooperation, which will be what we need if the recession that Goldman Sachs and Bank of America are telling us coming down the pike real close, if it hits, we're going to be real sorry that we don't have that coordination, or maybe we'll see a rapid recognition to put aside all of that noise and make a deal so we can survive together.